Olá, sejam muito bem-vindos, boa noite. Nosso terceiro dia do Congresso Internacional Conexões 2020, a educação gerando redes de transformação. E mais uma vez, a gente tem um painel internacional incrível com a Jean Gubbins. Vai ser uma palestra assim genial, como todas as estão sendo feitas até agora, e o nosso congresso ele continua amanhã cedo e vai até às 19 horas com grandes palestras, grandes atividades. Eu queria apresentar a Ângela Virgolim, a presidente do Conselho Brasileiro para a Superdotação, e dizer que este evento ele é uma realização dentro da parceria entre o Combrasde e o Instituto Alfa Lumen. Eu gostaria muito de passar a palavra para a Ângela para apresentar aí a nossa querida Jean Gubbins.
Boa noite, pessoal. Muito obrigada por estarem todos aqui conosco novamente. É um prazer imenso estar nessa mesa apresentando a professora Jean Gubbins. Welcome, dear Jean. I welcome you to this Congress, and I want to say that it's an honor to be here with you, presenting you, and with all the things that you symbolize to me as a teacher and a colleague, and I'm very, very happy to have you here. Jean Gubbins foi a minha orientadora de doutorado nos Estados Unidos, uma pessoa de quem eu aprendi a gostar muito, uma pessoa firme, uma orientadora fantástica, teve muita paciência com o meu inglês. You have lots of patience with my English, because it's still not good, but é uma coisa muito boa a gente ter uma tradição como eles têm no Renzulli Center, em toda a University of Connecticut, né? É assim, é o relacionamento, né, dos seus orientadores com os alunos, né? Então, especialmente ali, foi uma coisa muito próxima, muito querida, né? Então, a gente teve um relacionamento fantástico nos tempos que eu passei lá. E então, pessoalmente, é uma honra ter a professora Jean Gubbins aqui. I will present a little bit about your resume, ok? A professora Jean Gubbins vai apresentar a palestra Um Olhar Mais Atento às Características dos Alunos com Superdotação e Talento. A Jean é professora do Departamento de Psicologia Educacional na Universidade de Connecticut, por meio de subsídios do Departamento de Educação dos Estados Unidos para o National Research Center on the Gifted and Talented. A doutora Gubbins implementou estudos de pesquisa com foco nas estratégias e práticas curriculares em ciência, tecnologia, engenharia e matemática para o ensino médio, educação em leitura e matemática no ensino fundamental e desenvolvimento profissional e pedagogia da educação de superdotados para todos os alunos. Atualmente é diretora associada do novo centro financiado por doações, agora se chama National Center for Research on Gifted Education, da Universidade de Connecticut, com foco em práticas exemplares de identificação e programação para alunos superdotados e talentosos de grupos subrepresentados. Ela é a pesquisadora principal do programa Thinking Like Mathematicians, Challenge All Grade 3 Students, pensando como matemáticos, desafiando todos os alunos da terceira série. E co-pesquisadora principal do projeto Bump Up, Building Up Mathematics Proficiency Utilizing Push-In. Ambos os projetos de pesquisa são financiados pelo Programa de Educação de Superdotados Jacob Javits. A experiência da doutora Gubbins em avaliação de programas permitiu que ela conduzisse mais de 45 avaliações de programas para distritos escolares em todo o país e implementasse avaliações integradas de alfabetização e artes para organizações sem fins lucrativos. Seus interesses de pesquisa, avaliação e ensino derivam de experiências anteriores como professora de sala de aula, professora de alunos superdotados e talentosos, consultora de avaliação e desenvolvedora profissional. Ela ministra cursos de pós-graduação em educação de superdotados e desenvolvimento de talentos relacionados à identificação, programação, desenvolvimento de currículo e avaliação de programas. Artigos, capítulos de livros, livros editados e um e-book destacam a variedade de tópicos que ela aborda no campo da educação de superdotados e talentosos. Então, nós vamos falar com uma pessoa que tem expertise na questão da identificação, na questão de como se organizar um programa para as altas habilidades de superdotação, e ela tem sido, durante todos esses anos, uma das grandes pesquisadoras do departamento, né, educacional, com inúmeros alunos, né, de pós-graduação se beneficiando da sua expertise. So, Jean, I talked a little bit about your great curriculum and resume, and I think everybody will be very thrilled to hear you. Very welcome to us. Ok? No final, nós vamos abrir para algumas perguntas, tá? Doutora Jean, it's you.
Thank you so much, Angela. I really appreciate all your comments. It's been such an honor to work with you for many years, and as well as several people from Brazil who have either graced our university as visiting scholars or as doctoral students. So it's been a nice connection between the University of Connecticut and Brasilia. I chose to talk about a really important topic this evening, a closer look at the characteristics of students with gifts and talents. I think it's important to think about identification and programming. And one of the things I always think about is identification is so very difficult. There are students who are very obviously bright in your classrooms. They're speaking early, they are responding very quickly to questions that are quite difficult. When I think about identification, I have to step back a little bit. I think I have to step back to why are you identifying? Think about a needs assessment. Think about what is the reason for you to bring students together? How are you going to screen them? How are you going to identify them? And then what happens when you place them? So this brings you to the idea of program planning. When you look at this diagram, it's very critical for you to think about all the pieces. And so the very top section that I've included on the diagram is mission. Again, identification for what? Why? To what extent? Why do these students need something different than they are actually getting right now in their daily classrooms? What are your goals? What would you like to have them accomplish as a result of programming? And in order to think about goals, who's going to be in that program? That's the identification piece. Exist on its own. Notice how it's all interconnected, because you have to have goals and objectives in programming. You have to have identification and evaluation. When I think about identification, I think about what's going to happen after I identify, as well as what's going to happen before I identify students. So it's a multi-step process. So one of the things to think about is you might be identifying for a certain reason. So there are three different approaches I'm going to take a look at in terms of conceptions of giftedness. This one by Joe Renzulli is very famous. It came out in 1978. At that point in time in our history of our field, it was not common to think about students who were just above average ability. It was the idea that the only students who could qualify for the idea of the label of gifted and talented would be the very, very, very high flyers, if you will, students who topped off on lots of different instruments. But the reality is, when you think about students and think back to someone that you taught maybe recently or years ago, or someone in your family right now, when you look at that person, you say, you know, what is it about this person who really does well in unique situations, who can problem solve, who can adapt to new situations, who can find a way to solve problems that no one else realized even existed? And so Joe went through the literature and thought about people who really made it, people who really did well. And they were not necessarily all the students that got the top grades. you also realize there's another component, the idea of creativity. You know, people who come to a solution that no one else thought of, people who see things differently, they sort of use that term, think outside the box. But there are also people who need to pursue what they are doing. So it's really interesting. We have very bright students who test well in school, but they may not do much with their abilities except take more tests and do what the teacher has asked them to do. Task commitment is a whole other level of motivation. You think of motivation as the idea of when you think of a floodlight, which is a wide expanse of light, versus a flashlight, which is a very narrow expanse of light. That's really a task when you are committed to doing something that interests you, that is really intriguing, that you want to accomplish. I'd also like to point out the background. That is what we call houndstooth fabric.
Excuse
in New England. Yes.
We can't see your slides presentation.
You
Maybe
cannot.
no. Maybe you can push the button, share screen.
Okay, so when I'm on this particular screen, there's no longer a Zoom thing that says share. So
Can help us.
okay, I got it. Should I start over?
Maybe a little.
Can you see them now?
Yes, yes.
So right now they're not in the right view, I think. So I need to change the view.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jean.
All right. So it went back. What would you like me to do, Angela?
Okay, you can begin just saying what you are saying. No problem.
From the slide I was on?
Yes, this one.
Okay. Or start from the beginning? Which direction?
No, yeah, you can go from here.
From here?
Yes, thank you.
Sorry. So one of the things I wanted to point out with this slide is the background. We call that houndstooth fabric. It's sort of like interlocking wool. It's very, very popular design. And the idea of that is that these three characteristics cannot exist in a vacuum. They exist in cultural groups, they exist in economic groups, they look in different areas, language groups. And so whatever your environment is, that gives you an opportunity to develop your talents and abilities, or it may be barriers to developing those talents and abilities. So this idea in 1978 was rather different because it really said there's much more to ability than just taking a test. Another perspective is something that we use in professional development with our different studies. And we found that people understand manifest abilities, something you can see, something you can hear, something you can view as in a drawing or a sculpture or a painting, something that you can recognize. That's very manifest. It's full-blown abilities that are very obvious. We chose to represent them by this full-blown daisy, if you will. But there's other two aspects of talent development. The idea that the emphasis on development, there are students you know who emerge in different areas that perhaps you're studying robotics, or perhaps you're studying astronomy, or you're teaching them a new language. And you realize that in that area, they're doing extremely well. They are really shining to such a great extent that there is an ability there that doesn't go across all subjects. It really is confined to a special area. There's also an area called latent. This is when there's something that could be developed. It's not showing up at too much right now, but it's going to show up under certain circumstances, which is why I use this. This is from Joe Renzulli, and these are a bunch of letters, but they'll make sense in a moment. So one of the things we realize is that people use and apply their talents and abilities in various ways. But think about this, in certain people, at certain times, under certain circumstances. So you may be an artist, you may be a musician, you may be a writer, you may be a doctor, a lawyer, you may be a plumber, electrician, but there are times when you are able to solve problems or think of ways to solve a problem in such a way that you're displaying your abilities at certain times, under certain circumstances, and in certain people. That's a very important aspect, because one of the things we tried to get away with Joe Renzulli and Sally Reese's work is that giftedness is not the test score. It's actually the behavior, how you apply your abilities in various circumstances. Not all, but certain ones that allow you to say, this is where I shine. This is where I really do well. This is my area of expertise that I want to develop, or I want to increase, or I want to practice even more. Another perspective is something that Mary Fraser from the University of Georgia shared when she was working with us for our research center. I really like this idea of these traits, aptitudes, and behaviors. There are 10 of them. Some of them are quite familiar to you, most likely, because they sort of sound like the kinds of things that we often talk about in terms of a student's ability. Things like memory. There are students who have this incredible storehouse of knowledge. They are based on either non-school or school topics. They may know all the stats related to a certain sport, but there are other things that are there that are not as well known or realized. I love the idea that humor, you can use a pun, or you can use a joke or a statement, and you can do it in front of an entire class of students, and there's one student who gets it. One student understands the inference, understands the way you're using words, the play on words. Other kinds of abilities that are on this slide are typical insight, grasping information. You do a science experiment, and the student understands how to replicate it, but even more so understands how to apply it to a similar situation or create a whole new approach to using that experiment. Interest, we don't give our students credit enough for the fact that they come with interests. Sometimes they're unusual, sometimes they're unique, sometimes they need to be developed. But when you are interested in something, you are more apt to spend time with it. That's where that task motivation comes in, where you really, that task commitment comes in, you really want to spend time with that area because that's interesting to you. Imagination and creativity are critical because you really want to think in a different way. You can't just replicate what someone else has done. You're going to think about a different perspective. We know that communication is critical for all students. Oral, visual, now technology obviously is a big area of emphasis. Inquiry, where students ask questions. When students are about 2 years old, they cannot stop asking questions about the world around them. They have questions about everything. But somehow along the way, about 3rd or 4th grade, they stop asking questions. One of the reasons for that is that we tell them, this is what you have to learn. This is the way you learn it, as opposed to, how would you like to learn this? Is there a different way to approach this? Is there a different way to show what you know? Problem-solving ability is also very critical. I mentioned that earlier. People who have that ability to really know that a problem exists before someone says, oh yeah, there's a problem here. Reasoning is critical thinking, reasoning, apply your ideas. And so these are important. These are 10, these are visible, observable characteristics, but I would like to point out the ones that are not as popular. Think about humor. The next time you're working with a young student, think about, is that student inferring things in a way that no one else is inferring that way? So there are lots of characteristics of learning, and some of these are typical kinds of things when I would say, the idea of student who has manifest abilities. These are sort of manifest abilities. The idea, these are obvious. Vocabulary is advanced for the age grade. They generalize about events, people, or things. They can come to conclusions. They can come up with synthesis of ideas. They also have a storehouse of information. You saw that on Mary Fraser's slide. But notice the idea of a certain topic, that they know something very deeply about something that perhaps they're very interested in. Unless we ask them questions about that topic area, we may not know how much knowledge they already carry and how much more they want to learn about that topic. Underlying principles, this is a very important thing. If you're talking about history or science or social studies, you're talking about different time periods or different people or different events. What do they have in common? What are the differences? Music, what are the patterns in music? What can you come up with the ideas about looking across history of the past 100 years? What would you find out? How do certain things work, whether it's the helicopter, whether it's a plane, whether it's just a very simple thing like trying to use this technology, whatever it may be. Creativity is incredible. It's that special ingredient that some people come born with it. You know, you watch little children playing and they're crawling around, they find something, an object, they investigate it, they tear it apart. They may not be able to put it together yet, but they're very imaginative. They make up words. They may be learning languages, as they do in Brazil, multiple languages. They may not know the exact word in Portuguese or Spanish or English, so they make up a word. They have that imaginative thinking ability. They know what it is, but they make up their ability to use very imaginative language. They come up with clever ideas or unique ideas. Their responses are this like, wow, you know, that was really something. I'm really impressed with what you said, or what you wrote, or what you drew. When other students were drawing or writing typical kinds of stories for a 10th grader or 11th grader or a 5th grader, they're coming up with something that's truly, truly unique and different. They're adventurous, the idea of taking risks. You know, risk taking is a hard thing to do. It requires a level of confidence. It also requires a level of abilities that you have, and you can say, you know, I can do this. I can take this risk. They are very adventurous. They want to try something different. They may have written a story that other people have said they're very impressed with at that point in time, but perhaps they want to publish it in a local journal or a magazine or newspaper for their age group. That's taking a risk, because then their work is going to be evaluated by someone else. It's going to be checked by someone else, and that is an area of taking a risk. A number of ideas, you know, we do a lot of things in creativity training where we ask students to be very fluent about how many ways they can think of something to happen. If you can generate a large number of ideas, what happens is you are basically throwing off ideas that are not that great at first, but as you dig deeper and think more deeply about, okay, what else can I come up with? You become almost in a point where you're making an evaluation statement and you're deciding, you know what, this is a better idea because I'm really thinking very hard. You're also, if you're doing it in a group, you are hitchhiking off of other people's ideas. They said something, it makes you think about something as well. Motivation, I mentioned earlier, being a critical component. I mentioned motivation versus task commitment. From Joe Renzulli's work, he called it motivation for these purposes. These are rating scale items that teachers can use to observe students, and they can decide to what extent they show all these characteristics or not. And it's done over time. It's not done in one setting. Concentration on a topic. You know, Csikszentmihalyi talks about flow. The idea when you are really intrigued by a topic, you have no idea of time, you have no idea that you haven't eaten, you just stay with the topic. They concentrate, you forget about everything that's around you, you block out information, you block out sound. You concentrate so deeply because that's something you're very intrigued by. Motivation is also something that you are self-motivated. You don't need direction from teachers. You know, we've been working at home from the university since March. And the other day I was talking to one of my colleagues and saying, you know, it makes no difference if I'm in the office like I used to be, or if I'm at home, working at home. I'm self-motivated. I know what I need to do. No one has to tell me what to do or when to do it. I am motivated. It's hard to get students motivated, I think, who are now not in school buildings like several of our students in Connecticut. But that motivation is critical. It requires the idea of how can you help them think about how will this benefit you? How will this task open up your world? How will the task benefit you so you become more interested in it? That interest in topics or problems, again, is so very critical. And that persistence, you know, the idea of staying in the struggle, that's a phrase that Rachel McAnally, one of our former doctoral students, uses all the time. The idea that you stay in the struggle, you don't give up. You make sure that you're going to come to some kind of resolution. You're going to come to some kind of conclusion. You want to see what's going to happen. Students who give up on something that's hard have really not learned how to work hard. We have found among our students who identify as gifted and talented that if school has been very, very easy for them for many, many years, they just believe that that's always going to be that way. There'll be a point where they hit a new content area, a different teacher, a new challenge, They do not know how to break down the task or the assignment or the project to small steps in order to accomplish it. They have not learned how to work hard. They memorize, they repeat, they put the information on the test the way they were given, but they're not being creative. They're not using their abilities in such a way to apply them to a high level. I included math because we're doing several projects in math right now that Angela mentioned to you. We're doing projects with grade 3 students. We're teaching them algebra in terms of trying to think about how multiplication, division, and algebra, they're all about patterns. And so algebraic thinking is a critical component of making sure you understand patterns in mathematics. We're also doing another study, it hasn't launched yet, we're in the preparation year, where we're going to be working with fourth and fifth graders in math as well. But one of the things we had talked about is the idea of, I don't know how to really observe eagerness, except for when kids are really excited about doing something and they actually like bounce to their desk, or they bounce up to you, to your desk, and they ask you a question. You know, they really want to solve a problem, or they have found an answer to a problem and they're so excited about that process. And that really is eagerness. We've also studied students who really understand how to take data, whether it's data from charts or graphs or creating charts and graphs. It's one thing to read graphs or tables or charts. It's a different thing to be able to take a whole bunch of information and create a graph or a table, showing a pattern, showing a persistent way of understanding something, to discover that pattern. And that does take time, effort, and it also takes some persistence, if you will. There are other students who love puzzles or logic games, or the idea they might have an opportunity to solve a problem, whether it's a word problem, whether it's a number problem. They can see the extension of a whole number series, and they do really well with it. Those kinds of early mathematics projects and ideas really come into play. Think about what they might have as very, very young children. When they are super, super young, are they being introduced to mathematical situations through cooking? Or they might be understanding it through counting some change if they get to that point. The idea of they're looking at numbers, or if they're in the grocery store and someone points out, you know, what it is per unit, what does it cost? Here's amount of money, what can you buy? What's going to be left over? If you have an allowance, how would you spend it? Graph that out, chart that out. How are you using your money? What are you doing with it? And then they understand concepts and processes. Conceptual understanding is very difficult at times. We find students can learn algorithms. They can learn the steps to division or multiplication or to certain kinds of things in proofs and geometry. They learn the steps. They may not understand what's going on behind it. The concepts is what we want to show. We have students in our study in grade 3 who are really, really excellent at solving problems in multiplication or division or algebraic thinking. But applying it to other areas that are different is much more difficult for them. They can't always understand what's going on with this algorithm. They can replicate it, but they can't create it in such a way that they can solve problems easily. We've also done several studies in reading with Sally Reese and others. It's an area of interest of ours, and we've done many different projects related to reading. You know, students, there are readers and there are non-readers, essentially, and that's awful to say as an educator. But there are students who learn about reading, the process of reading, by books in the home, by seeing their family members read, by being read to as a young infant, hearing the written word out loud, showing the pictures from a book. The idea of reading is the idea of you are trying to modify, try to adjust, try to think about what you are hearing and what you are seeing at a young age now becomes these funny looking characters on a piece of paper or in a book. How do you translate what you heard to the words, whatever script it may be in? And so students who have access to books in the home, students who are used to having their parents read to them, or their friends read to them, or their teachers read to them, and they realize that reading opens up a whole new world of opportunities. Those are the students who really want to do reading related activities. They want to know about authors. They want to know about concepts. They want to know, why does someone write this way? What about poetry? What about prose? What are different things I could write? How can I translate what I am saying into words on paper? Now, of course, now With technology, I could be saying something and it can type for me on my computer. That was not possible years ago, but that's another way of doing it, that you have the opportunity to actually use what you're saying and then obviously try to see what has been said and see what you can change or improve. And then reading for time. We did a study years ago in middle school in our country that those students are about 12, 13 years old. And so we found that their reading concentration was so very limited. They all had different books they had access to based on their interests, but their reading concentration, actually staying with the book, not just flipping pages. We call that fake reading, just keep flipping the pages. They haven't read the pages. We got them to a point where they really enjoyed the reading process because they were reading something that was interesting to them. They could focus on it over time, and that was important. We also found that oftentimes we ask students to read books that are too easy for them. If you're reading a book that's too easy, you're not coming across a new word, a new concept, a new phrase. You are just reading what you know. You should be reading books where you are questioning what that word is. You can probably get it from context by looking at pictures, if there are pictures or diagrams or graphs or whatever is around it. It's just plain basic text. By looking at what the sentences are around it, you'll get the information. It's more important to read something that's more difficult than it is to read something you already can decode, understand, and then read another similar book. We have students who read the same series, and unless they're reading something more difficult, they're not learning new words, new syntax, new styles, new writing approaches that are important. So I give you that background because I think it's all important to think about what can you observe before you think about what can you do to find those students. So the first question is, who are gifted and talented students? And some of the characteristics I just showed you will help you think about, oh, I remember a student I had years ago and I saw that characteristic. And if you think about those students who do well in school, but think about those students who do not do as well, except for certain content areas or at certain times under certain circumstances. And think about why you are striving to find them. Why do you want to identify them? Remember I said identification for what? Why are you trying to find them? You're trying to find them to increase, enhance, and extend their abilities. I'll say that again, to increase, enhance, and extend their abilities. You want them to keep learning at high levels as opposed to learning at a level that's convenient for them, that's easy for them. You have to find much more challenging work so they will learn at a much higher level. And how do we find them? So there are lots of different ways. There are appropriate ways to find students, and there are tools to do so. And there are many informal, there are many formal tools, there are many observation tools. It really is a matter of what are you identifying for? Are you identifying for a content area? Are you identifying globally? What do you want to know? And then what do you do with that information? How do you analyze it? How do you bring it together? And how do you interpret? If you have data points from multiple sources, how do you interpret it? And then who's responsible? Is it a team of people? Are you the only one observing the students? Are you the only one assessing the students? There are all kinds of tools, and here's a very long list of them. And you think about things that are common. So oftentimes we give students tests. In our country, we have state tests. We have students who are taking individual tests. They may vary by what types they are. They might be what we call norm reference. They might be intelligence tests or creativity tests. They might be grades. Grades are funny because they don't translate very well because everyone uses a different system. But tests give you a benchmark or an idea or an insight to what students can do compared to other students around the world, around the country. If it's a criterion reference test, other students taking the same test. There are also nominations. So the ones I gave you earlier on learning, motivation, creativity, reading, and math, those are all nomination approaches. They are scales you can use. They're items you can use to observe students and think about what students are doing, how are they doing well. Another aspect we don't often use very frequently, but I do like the idea, is sometimes with older students, students who are middle school, high school age students, secondary students, sometimes it's a matter of interviewing them. The teacher has recommended them in some format, either because activities or their student work or their products or their portfolios. But sometimes an interview really gets at, what do you want to learn about? How do you want to extend your learning? How can we help you learn more about a certain area or a certain topic? What can we do to enhance what you already know to something that's going to be much more challenging for you? Activity-based, I've used that in classrooms where I've gone into a classroom. I bring in a very complex problem. It might be a problem that requires writing. It might be a problem that requires them to manipulate objects. And I watch how students approach the problem and see how they solve it or don't solve it. That's more activity-based. I've also used what I call diagnostic placement. So in my program, I had students working with me for 5 hours a week. So sometimes I would invite other students I was thinking about or teachers were thinking about to come to this special program 5 hours a week, which is part of their school day, and see how they would work with other students who've been identified. That is a diagnostic placement. There's also, people in sports, people in the arts, people in theater, they have this really solved in so many ways. They look at auditions, they look at portfolios, they look at presentations and products. We don't do that as much in the academic area, but those are areas of interest if you are looking at the arts as well. And the rating scales are very similar to the nomination scales, oftentimes depending on who has come up with it. So here's an approach that is really simple. Because we have a lot of tests taken, I'm not sure what you do in Brazil, but we do a lot of tests in our country. And so if you do any group administered tests, you can say, all right, what are the local norms on the achievement test, if that's what you have? And I use local norms because you want to know how your students in Brasilia compare to other students in your country. You want to know how they compare to other students in a district or a school. I also think about intelligence tests. This is not a highest score you can get on an intelligence test. It might be a group test. It might be an individual test. But think about broadening. So this would be like the top 15% of your population. Think about those scales I showed you from Renzulli on learning, motivation, and creativity. Think about other things. Peer nomination. Sometimes I would have students say, you know what? Jose should be in our program. And I'd find out about Jose. And I find out, how Jose is doing in school. What is he doing well? What is he struggling with? What can I find out more about him? I also think that older students can self-nominate. So if it's a special class that you're thinking about, if it's a special situation they're going to go into, a special school, then they might nominate themselves. And then their profiles. What have they done? What have they accomplished at their young age? And think about all the things that you could possibly do to help the student continue on with these excellent areas of abilities or to develop them. I put in one for the arts as well, because the arts really has this, they've got this master. The whole identification piece is so much better in the arts field. For some reason in our field, we are so worried about numbers and so worried about scales and ratings and percentages. And the arts are looking at performance. They want to see, they want to listen, they want to watch, they want to get information from you. So the categories are similar, but they are really much more performance-based than they are in the field of academics. I show you this because I often find when I look at programs identification, they do funny things with data. So this one tells you that I'm looking at students with a 95th percentile, local percentiles. I'm looking at a student who has an IQ of 135 or above. I'm looking at a learning rating on one of those scales and motivation rating. So these are numbers that you might see on a test. If you look at the intelligence column, 135, 140, 137, you might see students in a local percentile, 95th percentile, 99th, 96th. It's going to be hard for you to believe, but this is a real true example of what someone did. This is what happens when you are trying to do identification, understand the numbers and what they actually mean. Someone added these numbers across in the row for each student. You can't do that. All of these scales are so very, very different. You can't add a percentile. They are ranks. They do not, you can't do anything with them except for ranks. You need a scale score. You can't add that to an IQ score. So I show this only because it was real. And when I saw it, I was sort of aghast at the idea that someone would think you, because they're numbers, you can add them together and get a total. I'm also amazed at the idea, that's when I get back to, remember I said that conceptions of understanding the concepts behind mathematics is so critical? They don't understand the concept behind testing. They don't understand the concept behind measurement. And so this really led to a very bad situation because they would pick out a student based on how high the number is, but that may not, it's not appropriate the way it's devised. Here's another approach. Joe, it's very similar to what I showed you just a few minutes ago. Joe has another approach where he talks about a talent pool. This idea I really like because you know what? There is no perfect identification system. You cannot predict what a child of 10 years old or 5 years old or 8 years old or 15 years old is going to do in the future. Think about your current adult friends. Ask them, what were they like when they were 10 as a student in school? You may be surprised to learn they were not the top performer. They were not the person who always got great grades in school, but they are highly accomplished now as adults. So I like this idea of having this whole notion of creating a talent pool where, you know what, instead of going through all that work with the local norms and so forth, they're like automatic entries. Take the students who are the top local percentiles, 92nd above, just put them all together. That brings your top academic performers on tests. And I want to emphasize the importance that these are students who do well on tests. Then think about those other students who are not as high on tests, but they show these characteristics through the case studies, through nominations, through parents telling you about the students when they're very young, what they accomplished, through action information. That means a teacher has sent you a note saying, this student has done incredible work. We were talking about a time period in music. This student knew everything about the musicians, about the time period, what was going on in the art world, as well as the musical world. So this is the other group of students where these are when you take a closer look at the students who are really important part of this situation. We also have teachers we call over and under nominators. In the district where I worked for several years, one school never nominated anyone. Another school nominated a whole bunch of kids. So why is that? So I had to go in and I had to spend time observing, talking with them, doing professional learning for them, having them understand those characteristics that are obvious, that are manifest, that are probably emergent because you're seeing a little light, but you haven't seen it fully emblazoned to a point of view that you say, wow, this kid is really spectacular. So think about the idea that you always want to leave it open to the idea that there are students out there who are waiting to be found, and they, for some reason, either have maxed their abilities, or perhaps there are barriers for them to show their abilities. Think about students who make what we call twice exceptional. They have a disability as well as a gift. People have a special education issue with reading, but they're phenomenal in math. When you're identifying, again, identification for what? Is it across the board? Or is it for a certain subject area like reading or math? So identification for anyone who gets involved in it is really problem solving. You have to think about who you are looking for. Also think about what you're going to do. How are you going to go about this? When are you going to do this? At the beginning of the year or at the end of the year? End of the year, oftentimes in spring, is a good time because that's when teachers know their students the best, if their students are new to them in that grade level. Where are you going to actually do this process? How are you going to work on this process? I want to point out the importance of why. Why are you identifying? That you have to understand. Remember that slide I showed you about mission? What is the purpose of what you're doing and how are you going to do it? So identification, you can't extricate it from programming because you can't just identify. You've got to do something with the students you identify. They need your attention. It's also important to codify what you're doing. You should write down, make it visible, make it appropriate so people know what is the identification process. If you Google Identification and gifted education, you'll get all kinds of information. Some of it may be good, some of it may not be good. When you're looking at your identification system, if you have one now, or if you're going to start one, make sure you understand where you're starting, that it's logical, it's defensible, it's research-based, it's written. It really reflects your population. Brazil is a huge country. There are certain populations that some types of programming might be better than others, depending on who's in your school, who's in your district. What are the characteristics? Is it effective? Make sure you're, again, focusing on needs and the definition. I showed you 3 approaches. There are many others that you can think about that may be more appropriate for what you want to think about your students and what they can do. You should think about, what does gifted mean to you? That's a very hard question. It's a very difficult question. There are many conceptions of giftedness. There are books written about them. And so you got to think about, what does it mean to you? What does it mean to us in your country? What does it mean to you in your school, in your district? Who does well in your schools? When you think about the graduates, who did really well? Wouldn't it be wonderful to take a little bit of time and talk to 5 students perhaps who really, really were excelling in high school and find out why? What worked for them? What would they change? What would they would like to have happen? It's also important to think about multiple tools. I showed you that slide of multiple tools of different types. It's not that you should have a lot of types of tools. Think about what tool matches the students' needs in your school or your district or your system. You know, one of the things I always think about, because I think identification is making decisions all the time. You know, when you make decisions about what you're going to have for lunch, or what you're going to buy for a car, or what you're going to choose tomorrow in terms of what color you're going to use for your slides, it really is about making options. And your decisions are not always going to be perfect. And that's what identification tells you. You're going to do the best that you can at the time you're doing it. Think about making decisions about weather. Meteorological information, I look at my phone, I listen to the news. It's not always right. It's hard. You're making a prediction about the future. So think about the fact that when you're trying to identify students, you're making a prediction about the future. You don't know what's going to happen. So that's why identification must be flexible. As students grow and change and develop, there are other students that are going to really shine over time. So decision-making, you know, what if I take this option? What if I take this approach? Is it going to be perfect? No, it's going to be a way to do it and a way to improve it. Always think about your system as malleable. It's going to get better over time. Think about the students who you selected. What are they doing? What could help them even do much better? What can they accomplish? And then evidence for thinking about the consequences. So you're thinking about, you make a decision about a student, say, I wasn't really sure. You pay attention, you go with your gut, and you say, you know what, this student needs this opportunity. And then how important is the consequence and why? What's the value? Decision-making is a very tough thing to do, but you're always making a decision about everything you're doing when you're talking about identification and programming. So I'm going to show you a few standards very quickly. I leave them for you to look at because they're important. One of the things I want to make sure when you're identifying is that you're representing the students on your campus, on your school, at your district. Your identified students should look like the students in your school or your district. That's very simple. You should also make sure you're identifying students because of their talents and gifts, and you're trying to make sure that they match what they're trying to do. Make sure why you're identifying is matching what they're doing. And they should be in diverse backgrounds. The idea that students come from all cultural groups, all language groups, all academic groups, they should be representing of who's in your school or who's in your program. We're talking about identification. It's also important to think about the idea of assessment, the idea of not only cognitive, but also affective. Think about social, emotional, and psychosocial. If you are the strongest performer in your school and you are now joined with other strong performers in several schools, you might have a very different impression of who really does well in my school. Think about the idea of progress. How are they going to show you they're still learning at high levels? And think about how are you going to track their progress over time, making sure that you have records, you set goals for them, you set mutual goals for them. So identification, if I had to think about 5 different terms or words, I would say comprehensive, making sure that it's appropriate for the students in your building, your district, however you're approaching this. Make sure you have multiple measures. Make sure that you are looking at more than one tool, because sometimes an observation or a case study or an interview or a conversation can give you so much more information. Make sure that your assessment is also going to be used afterwards. Whatever data you have collected, that should guide your decision-making about what the students will receive for programming. Make sure it's theory-based. We have a lot of research in our field. There's some really excellent work out there. Make sure you are paying attention to the latest information that you can possibly access. And I said earlier, codified. Write down what you are doing, because you can change or adapt it as you see how you're progressing over time. So screening a nomination. So I mentioned very early on, just to review a little bit, I said needs assessment. Why are you doing this? Think about preparation program for students, the idea of students who may not have the advantages of other students because of lack of books in their homes or opportunities to learn at high levels. What if you had a little mini program where you're actually taking a larger group of students and trying to increase their reading ability and their math ability? Those are preparation programs. Universal screening, screen all students. Make sure that whatever you're doing, your instrument match to what you want to accomplish. What are those goals? Use a team. One person, that's kind of hard for one person to make all those decisions. Think about case studies, think about final selection of students. I love this sentence that was written several years ago for Javits, J.K. Javits. He was a former governor from New York. And they wrote this incredible book called National Excellence, A Case for Developing America's Talent. And I love that idea, that a case for developing America's talent, because this is the phrase that I thought was so critical. Outstanding talents are present in children and youth from all cultural groups, across all economic strata, in all areas of human endeavor. This gets us beyond the idea that a test is the only source of information. It makes us move away to that. And so we have to make sure that we are taking time to think about program goals and students' needs. Make sure you are looking at acceleration, grade acceleration, subject acceleration, the idea of a student going from grade 4 to grade 6, idea of a 5th grader going to 7th grade for math, idea of make sure you take the time to pre-assess, find out what students know, and then find out what they need to know. The idea that you are looking at curriculum that's research-based. There are a lot of models out there for curriculum development. There are a lot of programs. There are a lot of things that you can purchase. Make sure it really extends what you're already doing. You want to make sure they're not learning what they already know. You want to make sure they are learning what they need to know. Here are some principles I want to share with you. The idea that you have these statements I said earlier, the written form, I'm emphasizing that again, and make sure you're reflecting the demographics of your district or your school. I mentioned the importance of multiple tools. Make sure your nominations are perhaps in multiple languages. You have to think about students who have other languages. Perhaps there are areas where they can be very successful on a math program, even though their language is other than the local language. And perhaps students who are from economically disadvantaged communities, they need opportunities to learn at high levels. So as you think about all the kinds of things that, again, I will emphasize, you have to defend why you are doing a system that you have written down, making sure you're choosing tools that are not biased, making sure that you are flexible, making sure that you are actually encouraging people to think about alternative entry points to programming and identification. Make sure you are using data that's appropriate, and you are updating your information over time. So identification is complex. It's not something that you go about and just do. It takes a lot of thinking, a lot of planning, a lot of research, a lot of understanding about tests and measurements, about observation tools. And so I leave you with the idea that identification plan or policy cannot be developed in isolation from the programming or curriculum that we provided to those students who are identified. Again, very early on, I said you cannot extricate one from the other. They are totally integrated. They are totally connected. The identification is always about for what, for whom, and what you're going to do with those students in the end. And so when you're thinking about the questions, the who, the how, the what, These are the kinds of questions you want to think about, from the who to what the outcomes are going to be. So those keys, again, are identification, intervention, make sure there's an infrastructure where this is going to happen, and your program and student outcomes. I love this phrase from Ted Sizer, that students differ may be inconvenient, but it is inescapable. Adapting to that diversity is the inevitable price of productivity, high standards, and fairness to the students. So this is my last slide. This is something that Mary Fraser, I really like this slide because what it reminds me of is I'm identifying a student. I'm always thinking about the child, but that child has to be surrounded by the programming options, the curricular needs, the counseling needs, and the goals and outcomes evaluations. That whatever you have learned about that child through the identification process, you have carefully orchestrated, thought about, tested out, thought about students who do well in programs, thought about former students you may know, asked the right questions. It all goes back to, what are you going to do for this child? Thank you so much for your time, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you, Jean. I think it was a wonderful explanation, and we have a lot of questions here. Many of our audience is from classrooms, they are teachers. And they are very interested in knowing more about the assessments, in particular in mathematics, for example. Douglas is a math teacher, and he asks, what are the best ways to assess the creativity of mathematically skilled students using problem solving?
I think the best way to do that, Douglas, is to give them a problem that's really complex, either a written, a tactile, a problem, a puzzle, a logic problem, and see how they respond. You know, students will play with mathematical ideas to a great extent. And when it's not an obvious, this is step 1, step 2, step 3, and they go outside that area and find a solution, it really does become important. There are a lot of things you can use that, you know, whether it's a puzzle or a logic problem. Logic problems, I find, are really quite informative because students are attacking them using their reasoning and their inquiry. And perhaps they're also using the skill of making a chart to figure out, you know, which person belongs in this place or what happens when. So I also think another way of assessing math ability is to go to if you're using a textbook, to go to the end of the textbook and find a problem at the very end of the textbook and see what that child knows on day 1 of school. Seriously, think about those kinds of things that are out there and available. There are also all kinds of problem-solving websites that are available that you can probably access very easily to give you some ideas about what to do.
Okay, it's a great idea. And Ana Paula and Luciano are very interested about motivation issues. Ana Paula says, I would like to ask Dr. Gubbins to talk a little bit more about lack of motivation and challenge and procrastination, especially in children. And Luciano asked, my son is an 11-year-old boy who was identified as gifted, but at the same time gets bored very easily. How to support kids like him to deal with frustration and lack of motivation? Are there tools for that?
So I guess there are 2 questions. One is the idea of that procrastination motivation. You know, you find some students who are easily, they say, oh, I'm bored. I don't know what the word is in Portuguese, so it probably has the same kind of feeling of, oh no, I don't want to hear that word again. You know, one of the things we find is they may be bored because of a couple of reasons. One is they already know the content, and we don't do enough pre-assessment to find out the answer to that question. The other reason is that they don't like the content area. They don't have an interest in that area. And so part of it is, you know, school is something you must do versus you can do. So there are certain things in content areas that you must do to get to the next level of stuff, of things you can do. And so procrastination, I can procrastinate big time, except when I have deadlines. And so sometimes what we have done with students who are not highly motivated is to set a contract that the teacher and the student sit down together and they create a little contract. This is what you're going to do during this week. At the end of the week, we'll take a look at where you are and see what you can do next week. For the parent, I think the idea that, when you think about students who perhaps are not as motivated, they're very, very bright. I often think of a particular student I had who just excelled at everything. And it was just amazing to me that he had no interest in doing anything but what was required of him. That there was just the idea of, I will do X amount of work and I won't do anything more, until he found out he was interested in astronomy. That's what the light went on, the light bulb went on, and he was really intrigued by a topic area that he could pursue. And so I got him involved in all kinds of things related to astronomy, and that made a huge difference.
Yeah, that's right. Well, Jessica asks, Jean, you talked about tools to find these gifted students among the crowd. But when they are found, what happens? How to spot the students in the classroom and maintain their interest, and at the same time teach to others who have a normal level of intellect. And usually we have 30 children in our classrooms.
That is a reality of teaching, that you might have 30 students in your room, you might have one student is very, very, very advanced. And so one of the things I don't know about your particular school system is to what extent would that child who is, let's say, 5th grade or 10 years old or whatever it may be, and was working in math at a 14-year-old level. Is it possible for that student to actually leave the classroom and work at a different grade level? And that may not be possible. If it's not possible to leave the classroom, if it's not possible to grade skip to go from grade 5 to grade 7, then it's the thing that has really made a difference for a lot of us is technology. If you have access to computers in the classroom or computers at home, if they're homeschooling at this point because of what's going on around the world, the idea that they will have technology, there are so many things, there's a program that's very popular. It's called Khan Academy, Khan. It's an online mathematics. It's on different content areas, and you can go at different grade levels. There's so many programs like that. I know Johns Hopkins in this country, as well as Stanford in this country, as well as Northwestern in this country. They have accelerated math or different kinds of programs for students. I'm not sure what's available for you, but I understand that if you are teaching 30 kids and you have one child who's really excel, you've got to have access to materials. And that really is a commitment from the school district to provide those materials and resources. The other thing, sometimes we can find opportunities for students to really do well as they are working on something that's more advanced. In reading, it's quite easy because you can find novels and books that are written at a much more advanced level that are appropriate for the content's appropriate, but the idea of using, instead of novels, the idea of using books about science or mathematics or social studies or historical events, oftentimes the language in those books is much more difficult than in a storybook. And so you can find books that are available, and hopefully you have a librarian who can help you search for those materials.
Yeah, okay. Fabiola asked, she says, congratulations on the exhibition. Could you develop a little bit about the disparity between identified boys and girls and black students?
Well, one of the things, and what was the last one? Boys, girls, and what was the last one?
Black
students. So that's why that phrase I put up at the end, the outstanding abilities, and talents occur across all cultural groups, across all language groups, across all economic groups. When you're identifying students, one year we made a major thing. We put blinds on all the data. We did not have names nor gender. And we identified the students. And when we got finished, we looked at, we took off the blind information. We realized we identified all boys in grade 6, only boys. We thought, okay, so that was not a good thing. And so you have to look at who you are identifying. You have to make sure that the students look like the students in your class, in your school, in your district. They're coming from different populations. In our country, we often do not identify students who are Black or Latino. are underserved in schools. They may be underserved at home. They may be underserved from different countries. And so that's why I mentioned that idea of preparation programs, where you provide these program opportunities that are really like hothouse opportunities to learning how to read or learning how to do mathematics, to make sure you are focusing on students. And so you shouldn't have, all boys like we did by mistake because we weren't really paying attention. And the idea that you are looking at your population appropriately.
Mm-hmm. And another issue we have here in our country is that gifted and talented students are still invisible for the politicals, for all the resources we need them. And what message would you say? What would you say to the community about it, identifying these children or spotting them in other settings, no?
Well, in the United States, we do not have a mandate for identifying and programming for gifted and talented students. We have tried for many, many years to have a mandate because we have a special education mandate since 1975. And Jacob Javits, that I mentioned to you earlier, he wanted the mandate to extend to gifted and talented, but it was not possible. And so what happens now in our country, every state decides whether or not they would like to have programming identification for students. And so about half of the states in our country have a mandate for identification and programming. The others do not. Connecticut is so strange because we have identification to mandate, but not to serve. And so one of the things I think about when I've gone to the legislature in Connecticut to try to promote mandating identification and programming, I always think about students. I give them a case study of a student. I tell them a very, very short story because their attention spans are short as legislators. They want to get through a lot of information. I tell them a story about a student who has really done well and why. I tell them about a student who could have done well and why not. What happened? The idea of trying to put a face and a name. So think about when I talked about looking at those high school students who might have been really top students that did really well in school or really well in college or really well in elementary school. Think about what they did and why, and tell their story about what they accomplished and why were they able to do so. And they need your support. They need our opportunities because they're the ones that are going to solve problems that we don't even know that exist right now.
Yeah, that's right. And another question came from, let me see, who is this? Ludmila, no? And it's all the worries we have about skipping grade and advancing students. And what about their social skills?
Right.
No? Is it prejudicial to them, or what do you think?
Well, that's a perfect question because one of our studies right now with our newly funded research center is on acceleration. And believe it or not, we're going to accelerate students in grade 2. So they're what, 7 years old? And in grade 3, 8 or 9 years old. And so we are going to do two things. We're going to work with schools to advance them either subject, reading or math, where they would go to another grade for reading and math, or they'd get extended reading or math within the grade, or they would be grade accelerated across all subject areas. So just before I joined you for this conference, I was reviewing some of the instruments that we have devised for information on this. So one of the things I'd highly recommend, and I believe it's in Portuguese as well. So if you would go on to Google and type in "a nation deceived,"
yes,
you'll end up at Iowa, University of Iowa. University of Iowa is working on this study with us. And you will find these books. There's a research book, volume 2, and a book that's volume 1. They're free, they're downloadable, and it talks about the myths associated with grade acceleration. Now we're going to start working on subject acceleration as well. There's also a second book, which is not free, unfortunately. It hasn't been translated as much. The other one has been translated all over the world in so many languages. But it really tells you, and it gives you the research background as well, the idea of acceleration. Angela mentioned social emotional. Also on the Iowa website, if you go into it's called Acceleration Institute. Once you get into the Iowa place, University of Iowa, if you just type in "a nation deceived," you'll end up there. The Acceleration Institute has videos, it has transcripts, it has interviews from students of all different ages. The idea is oftentimes students who are ready to accelerate grade-wise, they are more emotionally mature than their peers. Intellectually, obviously, academically, obviously, but they are ready. So you'll see they'll see taped interviews of students who have been accelerated and learn from them. It's an incredible force.
I think they are worried about the social skills, no, being with others at the same age and everything.
Yeah, and I accelerated, and I didn't do it that often. So when I was teaching in the classroom for 11 years, I only accelerated 2 students. One from 4th to 6th grade, which was not a big move because our school ended at grade 6 before it went into the middle school. And another student, I did a subject acceleration from 6th grade to high school. And that he went with another student from another school, and they both went to the high school classes. And it really is because the intellectual part, intellectually they're talking with their peers. Obviously, they don't have the same taste in music or dance or art or different kinds of things, but they're there for the intellectual part. At the University of Connecticut, we have students, well, we had, because we're now sort of shut down in many ways, but students don't have to, they come to the university for classes and they may be very young, they'd be 10 years old. And so it's not the social emotion. They do very, very well because they are getting their minds fed. They're getting their bodies fed by getting into areas they really, really like. What might be different is when they first join a group that's more accelerated, they may not dress the same way. They may not use the same lingo, but they're ready intellectually and they do very well.
Yeah, I suppose so. And the last one here, the child not identified in time may crystallize. And what would be a right age for identification? Maybe we talk about precocity.
Well, it's interesting because precocity is a highly researched field as well. And there are lots of different perspectives on what it is. Sometimes if you are a new mother or a new father and you're watching your infant and your infant starts talking at a very young age, you think about, wow, this child is really brilliant, or starts walking at a young age, and wow, this student is great, or starts playing with things, understands shapes and distance and so forth, and starts talking in different languages at a young age. Precocity is an interesting aspect because sometimes things level out as they grow up, as they go into their earlier years. Sometimes it stays with them. And sometimes that precociousness in early reading or early mathematics starts to level out for a very different reason because they're not given more challenging work. So there are certain things that when they're very, very young, you see that you take them to a museum or you take them on an adventure and they're totally enthralled by it and they ask questions all the time. As a parent or a guardian or someone who's in the home or a peer or a sister or a brother, you want to respond to them appropriately. And so over time, they may not do as well in school. They may start off very, very strong. They may not do as well because their needs are not being met. That's why I talked about how important it is to think about what do they need to extend, enhance what they already can do, not replicate what they can already do. And so, yeah, there are a lot of precocious children, but we have to make sure we feed intellectually as well as social emotionally their abilities so they can actually do well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right. And another thing is that sometimes children, one child only talk about one thing, has just one interest. And it's difficult for the teacher, it's difficult for the parents because they don't have any other interest. What do you suggest?
That's okay, though. You know what? That's okay. Some people love to collect stamps or collect coins, or they collect comic books or whatever it may be. So one of the things you have to think about is how can you move this into something else? So let's take stamps. I don't know if the person can tell you what the area of specialty is, but I'll use stamps as an example. Stamps are artistic, they're historical, they're political, they show so much. They might represent musicians, they might represent events, they might represent. So if you can get the idea of behind, if they collect certain kinds of stamps, whether or not some people collect stamps that are images of plants or flowers, some people collect stamps that are historical. So find out what kinds of stamps they are, and maybe you can hook them into other areas. If it's coins, again, coins, it's an incredible collection of historical. Why is this person on the coin? Who is a person who depicted this version of the person, or what's on the back of the coin, or why has this coin changed over time? There are many, many ways. Students who just like, let's say, robotics. Robotics is mathematical, it's scientific, it's manipulative. And so you have to think about, what does this particular interest have that can connect to other areas? What can you actually do to expand that area to something else? If the teacher is stuck by saying, well, he only wants to learn about this area if it's interesting because of its has some association with a certain area of astronomy or biology or whatever it may be, then it really is trying to give them what we call interestalizer, where it has lots and lots of questions with various fields, and they respond to a series of questions about designing experiments, creating a new toy, selling something at a fair, finding out, trying to create a piece of music, listening to a story, writing a story. So we give them an interestalizer, we have them respond to a series of questions, and then we think about, okay, what do they really want to do to broaden that?
Yeah. And the last question, I think we have time just for that. Ghislaine says, in the United States, she would like you to talk more about what kind of tests or checklists or things like that a teacher can do inside the classroom,
Sure.
Just identification better.
Right. So I would suggest that you actually do a quick search for things such as identification tools or instruments. And one of the things I showed you was the Renzulli scales. They have a very long name, but if you just look up Renzulli scales, you'll get to the publisher and you'll find out there are 14 of them. They go into leadership and motivation, they go into communication, music and arts and so forth. Those are the items I showed you under learning, motivation, creativity, math, and reading. Those are part of them. And so those are observation tools. You can also use the tool I showed you from Mary Fraser, having those 10 characteristics. You can create a little Excel file, if you will, or a chart or a graph, put the student's name in the column, put the characteristics in the row, and just check off as you're watching students do different things. There are many tools. I don't know, the problem is oftentimes that they're available in English, but not other languages. There are some IQ tests that are available in Spanish. There are some nonverbal IQ tests that are available. But again, what is your program doing? So Naglieri has a series of IQ tests that are reasoning, but they're all pictures and diagrams. It doesn't require language. There are certain things like that that are easily transportable to other countries, or other things. I know that oftentimes different countries, they take an instrument and they adapt it to their culture and their language, and they actually experiment in the language. They have norms they built in that way.
Mm-hmm. And we are doing a lot of research on that, and make sure that teachers can use some of these instruments as well. And at least some of our colleagues are here and says hi. They want
I saw Denise's name.
Is here, Maria Lúcia Sabatella, Renata Prado, lots of people who wants me to hug you.
We've been so lucky. Jane was with us recently as a visiting scholar. We've had other visiting scholars. We've had people. We have a new doctoral student from Brazil that was recommended. And so it's been wonderful. Our connection with Brazil has been phenomenal. We've met so many different people who have come to visit us, or we have met at conferences. And usually this is a time when we get together at conferences, live, and we find Eunice. We always have a joy to meet with her and so forth. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So you were great, and thank you for your kindness. And I hope next year we can hug personally. And thank you very much. It was a wonderful conference.
In behalf of Instituto Alfalumen, we want to thank you very, very much. We are an NGO in Brazil, and we are very pleased to have you here with us, and very, very happy.
Oh, thank you so much.
Okay, I see you. All my love to you and everybody.
Bye. Take care.
Obrigada.